shining every day. All along the way, there's a rainbow of perfect love on the land and sea. Shine for you and me. There's a rainbow of perfect love. There's a rainbow shining of love.
We are in a series of lessons entitled what? There you go. The teachings of Jesus. Not chronologically, not coming just out of one of the Gospels, but we're looking at just various teachings of Jesus that maybe we don't spend as much time talking about. And sometimes they're not like today's lesson. It's not going to be exactly the teachings of Jesus, but it comes from one of the Gospel accounts. Okay? I'm not going to give you the notes yet. I'm going to hold off on that just a few minutes because y'all cheat. Y'all look down at my notes and then act like you're smart, and I'm trying to find out how smart y'all really are. Okay? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are known as the synoptic Gospels. Okay? S-N-Y, sin, S-Y, now I'll get this right. S-Y-N-O, okay, snop, P-T-I-C, synoptic. What does that mean? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the synoptic Gospels. Anywhere, any commentator you read, anything you start studying about the Gospels, that's going to be one of the statements they make. Oh, these are the synoptics. What does that mean? Okay. Aaron? There you go. Similar. Okay? These three Gospels are extremely similar in nature. In fact, there are some of the texts that you can turn to in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and guess what? The verses are almost identical. Okay? It's almost as if they copied from one another. They're so closely related to one another. And then we have a fourth Gospel, don't we? And that is what? The Gospel of John. And guess what? John's Gospel ain't synoptic. Okay? It's not one of the synoptic Gospels. The minute you open up the Gospel of John and you begin to read, guess what? You know this thing isn't like the rest of the Gospels. Okay? John's Gospel was written later than the other three Gospels were. Okay? And John, when he picks up this book, or when he begins to write this book, he has a very clear purpose in his mind as to why he was writing it. Now, that's not something that's new, all right? Every book of the Bible has a purpose in mind when the writer begins to write. Every book does, okay? Some of them are very clear in their expression of the purpose, and some of them are purposes that we have to glean by reading the book itself. John tells us exactly what his purpose is. Turn over to John chapter 20, and let's read verses 30 and 31. I refer to this as the key verse of the Gospel of John. Somebody get there? Just start reading.
These were written that you may believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life through His name.
Okay? Notice why he begins. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of His disciples, which are not written in this book. Okay? How many miracles did Jesus perform? Well, that's a difficult one, isn't it? Okay? Because the Bible does not expressly tell us how many miracles Jesus did. Turn to one chapter over, John 21, and let's read a verse there. John 21:25. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain what? The books that should be written. Wow. Now that's a hyperbole. Does anybody know what that is? A hyperbole. Now you're back in high school and you're going, oh, I graduated from there 100 years ago. Okay, what's a hyperbole? Yes, an extreme exaggeration, okay? Surely, during the life of Jesus, somebody could have followed him around and taken note of all the deeds that he did, and we could have recorded those deeds and had them in enough, had a volume. Maybe it'd be huge, but we could have had it in our possession. This is a hyperbole in order to express the enormity of the deeds that Jesus did in his life. The world could not contain the books that should be written, he says. So we don't have the exact number of miracles that Jesus did. And John, in his gospel, chose to not write about some of them. How many miracles do we have recorded for us in the gospel accounts? Anybody know that? Nobody knows that. Somewhere around 35. Okay, 35 miracles are recorded for us in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? John, however, doesn't even record 35. John doesn't record 30. John doesn't record 15. He doesn't record 10. Now, I find this amazing. How far are we going down, right? How many does John record? 8 miracles of Jesus. That's all, folks. 8 miracles. Now listen to what John says back there in his purpose statement in John 20, 30 and 31. But these are written, these 8 are written, that ye might what? Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through His name. I don't need 35. I don't need 30. I don't need 20. I don't need 15. I don't need 9. If you'll take these 8 miracles, and if you will honestly observe them, if you will honestly consider them, you will walk away believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I just find that's interesting. Now, what are the 8? Now I can pass these out. Okay. Get a couple of folks to help me. Everybody can get one. What are the 8? Well, let me just run the list. If you're taking notes, you don't have to because they're in the handout that I'm about to give you. But number 1, I've already given it away. Very first miracle was what? Yes, turning the water into wine at the marriage feast in Cana of Galilee. And I find it interesting that John is the only one that gives us that miracle. Okay, he's the only one that tells us about turning water into wine. Secondly, there is the healing of the nobleman's son. Okay, the healing of the nobleman's son. Thirdly, the healing of the lame man. Fourthly, the feeding of the 5,000. Did Jesus feed another group of individuals? Yeah, He fed another group of 4,000. In this 5,000, it says 5,000 men. So it was even more than that were there. But we call it the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus walks on the water. How many times did He do that? 2 times. Okay, 2 times that He walked on the water. Okay, but He only records one of those. In John 9, verses 1 through 7, and folks, this is the one that finally gets Him into massive trouble. Okay, the healing of the blind man. That miracle, for some reason, immediately ignited the fervor of the Jews against Jesus, and at that point, everything changed. Okay, as far as the Jews were concerned, they didn't like Him before. Okay? And, there's a lot of rumblings about Him, but this one was really the one that sparked the Jews for some reason. Okay? There's also the raising of Lazarus from the dead. John's the only writer who tells us about that one. Okay? And then the last one is the miracle of the catching of the fish. Remember, they'd gone out to fish and they came back and what? Not a thing, right? Jesus said, cast your nets on the other side. And what did they get? Song says a boat full of fishes. Is really a net full of fishes, wasn't it? Okay? And so those are the 8 miracles. Now, what are miracles intended to do? What are they? What's their purpose?
Produce belief.
Okay, to produce belief. But how do they do that?
They serve as evidence of something else.
Okay, but how?
Oh, through a suspension of the norms and the standards that we're accustomed to. They transcend thought and reason.
Okay, yes, it shows whoever the miracle worker is, it shows that they have power over and beyond, like you said, the norm or natural law, the world as we know it. Okay? Take, for instance, when it comes to water and wine, does there have to be water involved in the production of wine? Yeah, has to be. You have to water the vineyards, right? And then, even after that, sometimes water is added to wine. But what did Jesus do? He just sped up the process without grapes in between. Okay? So, yes, water was needed, and yes, wine would come with the use of water, but Jesus says, I don't need those grapes. Okay? I'll just give you what? I'll just give you wine. Healing. Now, we have a lot of medications today that can bring about healing, right? But usually, doesn't it take place over a fairly lengthy period of time? You know, I wish they had an antibiotic that you could take, you know, and be over a sinus infection in about an hour. Don't you? Or wouldn't it be nice if you just took it and it's just gone? You know, give me one of those. 2 of them. I'll stick one in my pocket for extra. But man, yes, man can use medications, but when Jesus healed people, guess what He didn't use? No medications, and it was immediate, instant healing, wasn't it? Jesus had power over disease and over the body of man. I'm still intrigued with this feeding of the 5,000 thing. Okay? They only had a few loaves and a couple of fishes. Have you ever studied those loaves and fishes and what they were? You know, you may think it was a whale that they caught and, brought 2 big old loaves of Wonder Bread or something, you know. That wasn't what it was it? It was more like crackers and sardines. Now, my daddy used to eat that, and that was nasty. Okay, but he used to like that stuff. But folks, I don't know about you, when you open a can of sardines, that's not much meat, is it? And 3 or 4 little crackers, and all of a sudden, you got 5,000 people out there, and if they eat like y'all do, or about to do, that crowd needed some food, didn't they? Can you imagine Jesus start breaking that, handing it to the disciples, and what happens? It just keeps coming. It just keeps coming. Where does it come from? Can you imagine being an apostle or someone standing there watching that and witnessing that, and it just keeps what? It just keeps coming. Here you go, guys. Enough to feed 5,000 and have baskets left over. I just would, let me be there and watch that. I love to be at the movie theater and watch that popcorn come out of the popper, don't you? I can just imagine when Jesus was, making all that food for individuals, what it must have been like. And then you have a man by the name of Lazarus, raised from the what? Dead. Folks, Jesus has power over the Hadean realm. Okay? If Jesus wants somebody out of the Hadean realm, guess what? He can get him out, can't he? One individual said that one of the reasons Jesus cries is because he knew he was about to call Lazarus back to this world from a place that was better. That's interesting, isn't it? Can you imagine knowing what's there and thinking, I'm about to call him back? Can you imagine Lazarus when he got back? I bet he and Jesus had some long talks. Okay? But he has power over what? He had power over the dead, did he not? Okay? And so it was evidence of this divine power. And that divine power, not just any power, divine power is what proves that he's what? The Son of the living God. You got an atheist, you want to convert him to Jesus Christ, wanting to believe in Jesus as the Son of God, give him the gospel of what? John. That's what it's designed to do, is to produce faith in man. Now that man has to have a good and honest heart, doesn't he? Now, our focus in this study and next week's study is what we refer to as the prologue of John's Gospel. The prologue. It is John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. Okay? We've read it probably 1,000 times, but it's amazing what's in it. Okay, that's the reason I want to spend some time talking about it in this class, because it's just astounding what's in it. What is a prologue? Now here you go. You're going to start reading my notes.
It's just a sort of a section that comes before the main section.
Okay, a section before the main section. Okay? Notice the two definitions that I give you. A preliminary discourse and introductory statement. Okay? So, in these first 18 verses, John is setting the tone and the tenor for the rest of the gospel, folks. Okay? Now, here's something that's interesting that I want to talk to you about by way of introduction to the Gospel of John. Because John doesn't come out and just make this statement. Now, a while ago we said, what was John's purpose? What is it? Okay? Get them to believe what? Yeah, that Jesus is the Son of God. Folks, keep that in mind. Okay? All of us believe Jesus is the Son of God. You believe that? Boy, y'all are weak today. Boy, let's don't get too bold in our proclamations, folks. Yeah, we believe that, don't we? We don't have any problem with that. There were individuals in the first century who were known as Gnostics. Okay, Gnostics, Gnostics. The word Gnostic comes from a Greek word, gnosis. And all that word means is knowledge. When I read to you this morning about Paul's desire in Colossians 1 verse 10, for those individuals to increase in the knowledge of God, the gnosis of God. So the Greek word in and of itself is not an evil term. It was made into an evil term, okay, in the first century because of the beliefs that were behind it. These individuals who were Gnostics, some refer to them as pre-gnostics because the theory kept developing and developing and developing into the second century, and you read a lot more about it in second century writings. But you see New Testament writers confronting it just like right here in the Gospel of John. Okay? The Gnostics believed that they had superior knowledge. They were what? We are the Gnostics. We're the knowledgeable ones. We have knowledge that some of you other members don't have. There was a main belief that runs through all Gnosticism, okay? And it's simply this: spirit is good, flesh is bad. That's a pretty simple concept, isn't it? Spirit is what? Good. Flesh is bad. Guys, that is their foundational belief for this system of thought that developed. And it's amazing what came from this system, and it's amazing the remnants of that system today. There are still groups of people who hold on to some of these tenets even today. Okay? God is what? Spirit. John 4:24. God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. God is all what? Good. Uh-oh. We humans, we got some what on us? Some flesh. So guess what we are? We are bad. Okay? We're bad. We're flesh. Flesh is evil. Now, think about that. God is all good, right? Flesh is all bad. Now, here we come in the first century, and what is one of the main tenets of the Christian faith? God has manifested Himself in the flesh. The Gnostic says, how can that be? How can that be? How can you take an all-good God and put Him where? In all evil flesh. You can't do that. That was their thinking. Okay? Now, from that concept, okay, numerous theories developed, and one was this, okay? Jesus never came in the flesh. Okay? That was one of the Gnostic concepts of the first century. Jesus never came in the flesh. God never came in the flesh. Turn over to 1 John for just a minute. Let's read a couple of passages of Scripture. Somebody read 1 John 4, verse 3.
And every spirit that confesses not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God.
Stop. Did you hear what he just said? Now, why did John write that? Every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. Why did he say that? Because there were people teaching that then. There were people teaching that Jesus has not come in the flesh. And he says, if you teach that, you are not of who? You are not of God. Listen to what he goes on to say.
And this is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof we have heard that it should come, and even now already is it in the world.
You teach that Jesus hasn't come in the flesh, and guess what you are? You are the Antichrist. I just find it interesting because we have individuals today who tell us that the Antichrist hasn't come. Premillennialists are still looking for the Antichrist. Look what John says about this Antichrist. And this is the spirit of Antichrist. Where have you heard that it should come in the world? Now listen to what he says. And even now already is it where? In the world, folks. The Antichrist was living in the first century. Guess who he was? Those group of people who taught that Jesus didn't come in the flesh. They're the Antichrists. They're speaking against the Christ. Turn over to 2 John. Look at verse 7. For many deceivers are entered into the world who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an antichrist. Folks, I'm not looking for an antichrist today. You know that? He existed in the first century. He'd been around a long time. Are there still individuals who deny that Jesus ever came in the flesh? Oh yeah, there's still people who teach that today. Okay? But there were individuals who specifically taught it in the days of John. Okay? Now, go back to 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. Now remember, the Antichrist says God didn't come in the what? In the flesh. What does John say? John 1:1. Somebody read it.
From the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled the word of life.
Unbelievable. John starts in the very first verse confronting what? Gnosticism. Very first verse. Listen to what he says. That which was from the beginning. Folks, if it's from the beginning, guess what that means? It's eternal. Okay? This is God I'm talking about. That which was from the beginning. Okay? The one who was there before the beginning ever, when the beginning came into existence, guess what? He was there. I'm talking about the eternal God. That's who I'm talking about. Now listen to what he says. Which we have heard, because he what? Because he spoke in the flesh to us. Notice what he goes on to say. Which we have what? Seen with our eyes. Can you see any spirit beings? You can't see a spirit being, an all-spirit being, unless He manifests Himself to you. Can't see Him. But guess what? John says, we've seen that which was from the beginning. Why did they see Him? Because He had a what? He had a fleshly body, didn't He? Now look what He goes on to say. Which we have looked upon, and our hands have what? Our hands have handled, folks. They actually touched Jesus. You think there were times when they were apart from one another, they come back together, what would they do? Hug one another. Back then it was customary to kiss one another on the cheek. You laugh and you slap somebody on the back, right? You're messing around with them and you touch them different places. John said, guess what, guys? Our hands have handled Him. We've heard Him. We've seen Him. We've touched Him. We know He's what? We know He's real. We know God came in the what? In the flesh. And if you deny that, you're a what? You're an antichrist. Wow. Now, that's 1 John. Who wrote the Gospel of John? Same person. Right? Very same person. Now, John doesn't start a gospel off and say, now guys, I'm about to refute the Gnosticism, but guess what? When he opens his gospel, he begins to refute Gnosticism. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, watch this, and the Word was God. He just established the deity of Jesus. He is God. Okay, not a God, like the Jehovah's Witnesses tell us. He is God. And the word God there is, guess what? Theos. He is God. He is divine. He is the supreme deity. And then in verse 14, what does he say? Uh-oh. And the Word was made flesh. Now, that's the very thing that the Gnostics said can't happen. God, verse 1, can't become flesh. John says, He did become flesh. And the Word was made flesh. And what? Dwelt among us. And we beheld His what? His glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Wow. John proclaims at the very outset of his prologue that Jesus came in the flesh. And you Gnostics are dead wrong. We don't like preachers preaching against false doctrine. You'd have hated John. Unless you wouldn't have known what he was doing. Okay? Because let me tell you what, folks. He tears them up. And guess what he does? Throughout the totality of this book, he proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this being, Jesus, who came in the flesh, is who? The Son of the living God. And I'm going to do that by showing you these 8 miracles that Jesus performed. Folks, this is a powerful, powerful gospel that was written when you understand what's behind it. Okay? I just find it interesting that the apostles were not scared to confront false doctrine. The apostles were not scared to take a stand when a stand needed to be taken. You think this gospel went throughout all the churches after it was written? Oh, absolutely. Can you imagine being a Gnostic in a congregation and you get the Gospel of John and within 14 verses he's told you God came in the flesh? Well, no, He did. Yes, He did. John just said He did. And he's an apostle and he was there. And he knows exactly what transpired. I just find it interesting. Questions or comments about that part? Anybody? Jim?
Remember, John was one of the 3 that saw Jesus transfigured, so he did see His glory.
He did. Absolutely. And he says it, doesn't it? We beheld His glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He witnessed that event, didn't he? He was right there. Unbelievable. Any other questions or comments? I don't have much time. It's unbelievable. Okay? Now,
I just think that, when you think about it, even though we all have choices, then they were just like everybody else. They could choose to disregard things. But these men were literally compelled. They were trapped, convicted. All this evidence was dumped right on them. They had no choice but to tell the truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, well, when you lived through it, like they had lived through it, and they were fully convicted of it, weren't they? And their hearts burned with them to tell the story. Let me do two things real quickly, okay? I may mention to you how this theory of Gnosticism was a very developed theory. Let me tell you a couple of things about it, okay? Who created flesh?
God.
Uh-oh. That ain't good. How could an all-good God Spirit create all bad, wicked flesh? So here's the theory they developed. They developed a theory that God the Father didn't create. Okay? What created were what they refer to as emanations from God. Okay? God would create another spirit being, and then another spirit being would be created, and another spirit being would be created. So what are we doing? We're moving farther and farther and farther away from who? The all-good God. You finally get far enough away from the all-good God, and Jesus, an emanation from God, can create what? Flesh. Well, that poses a problem. Because are we just all flesh? What happens at death? Oh, you got a spirit too. You're a combination of flesh and what? Spirit. So two theories developed, okay, with regard to man. One theory said this: there's absolutely nothing you can do about the contradiction that exists in our body between flesh and spirit. Okay? Your flesh is always going to be evil. Your spirit is always going to be what? Good. When you die, that settles a problem. Right? Spirit's good, gone from the body. So, guess what? Eat, drink, and be merry. Right? Just do whatever you want to do in the flesh, because once you die and the spirit separates from it, guess what? The spirit's going to be good anyway. And then there's another that said, oh no, you can't do that. You can't just live any way you want to. You've got to discipline the flesh, and Paul said that. I keep under my body and bring it into subjection. I buffet my body, he says. So guess what? They started practicing.
Self-flagellation.
Exactly right. Where you actually began to whip and beat and cut and tear the flesh to bring it into subjection so your spirit could obey God. Unbelievable, isn't it? So you see, once you embrace a false doctrine, that false doctrine leads you down thousands of roads, does it not? Yes. It's unbelievable. Now, what I want us to do is not miss not only the purpose of John's prologue to confront Gnosticism, but what's in it. Okay? I don't know exactly how many false doctrines. There's about 20 false doctrines that John confronts in John 1, verses 1 through 18. False doctrines that exist today. Okay? I want you to notice the fourfold division, though. Verses 1 through 3, he talks about the Word. And he gives us a lot of interesting information about the Word. We'll talk about it next week. He then changes and he begins to speak of Jesus as the light. Okay? And he tells us some wonderful things about the light and what it was here doing. And then we get to the third one and he talks about the reaction. Okay? Here's this light that's come into the world, and how does the world react to it? How do the Jews react to it? And does everybody reject Him? So he talks about that. And then he changes a little bit more and he talks about the incarnation of the Word in the fourth section, and we'll talk about that next week. Questions or comments? Wonderful, wonderful text, man. I'm telling you what, makes you get excited. If you don't, something wrong with you. Thank y'all. Let's go eat something.